Okay. All right, we're live streaming on YouTube. Welcome to my Bible study. I'm Pam Fox, and we've been studying through the book of Leviticus. We're at the very tail end. I think we're in chapter 25 or 26 or something like that. There's 27 chapters, so we're getting close. But I wanted to stop and talk about God's plan of redemption, which I'm pretty excited about. What I want to do, first of all, is kind of nutshell it. I want to give what I see as God's plan of redemption kind of in a nutshell. And I want to talk about it before we start. This is going to be a two-part Bible study, and I want to talk about it in that nutshell kind of in more depth next week. It's kind of the crux of the whole Bible study. It's really important understanding that is what God's plan of redemption looks like and what it looks like for us, right? God already redeemed the nation of Israel in the book of Exodus to give us this pattern, to show us what God's plan of redemption looks like, and to give us additional clues, because we can match up God's whole plan of redemption with the timeline of Christ and with the end times, and we can see how it all lines up. But we're given additional clues and information from the Old Testament story of the Exodus. Let's look really quick to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We've looked at this Bible verse. It's 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, I believe, where Paul... Let's go ahead and just start at verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Paul is revisiting the story of the Exodus, the redemption of God's firstborn son, Israel. How their fathers were under the cloud. Remember, they were under that pillar of cloud and all passed through the sea. And were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. That was their baptism when they walked through that sea in the cloud, the pillar of cloud. They all ate the same spiritual meat. They all drank the same spiritual drink. Let's go down to verse 6. Now these things, this story of the Exodus, were our examples. They were our examples, Paul says. They were written down for us, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. There's a warning in the Exodus story. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. And of course, this play, it's the word to sport, and it's used elsewhere in the Old Testament, where I don't remember if it was Abraham and Sarah or if it was Isaac and Rebekah. Nevertheless, both of those couples went to Egypt and lied and said, yeah, she's my sister, not my wife, my sister. But then they were seen sporting in the field. This word sport, at this golden calf debacle, they were eating and drinking and sporting before the golden calf, which wasn't anything unusual if you were born and raised in Egypt. And God says, no, that's evil. He says, you lust after evil things as they all lusted. They sat down to eat and drink. They rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. For murmuring, remember, there are many examples where this group of people, they face a hard time and they say, we should have stayed in Egypt. We never should have left Egypt. We'd be better off in Egypt. They grumbled and complained. After all that God did for them, they grumbled and complained. And then it goes on to say in verse 11, now all these happened unto them for ensamples. This word ensample means a pattern or a blueprint. All these things happened to them for patterns and blueprints, and they are written for our admonition. This word admonition means warning and or instruction. So the story of the Exodus, God's redeeming of his people, it happened and it was written down as a pattern for you and for me, so that we can better understand our path to redemption and our redemption story and what God is doing for you and for me and what he plans to do for you and me in terms of our redemption. It says they're written down for our admonition, upon whom The ends of the world are come. And so Paul lived his life and encouraged other people to live their lives as if Jesus was coming back, as if he was fulfilling the promise of returning in their lifetime. And ever since Paul lived and died and encouraged people to do this, people have lived and died awaiting the return of our Lord and expecting it to happen in our lifetime. And here we are a couple of thousand years later, where we still continue to wait for the return of our Lord in our lifetime, because Jesus said we need to be ready when he shows up. We need to be ready. And if you're focused on other things and you don't love his appearing and you don't try to understand what God is doing, then you're not waiting, you're not watching, and you're not preparing yourself. You're not ready. Okay. And Jesus wants us to be ready when he does show up. And so we can't be ready if we're not expecting him. And so if you're one of those Christians that say, oh, he promised he would return, and now he's been 2,000 years and he's not here, and all those people that thought he would come in their lifetime, they were wrong. And so therefore, I'm not going to expect that Jesus would come in my lifetime. That's how I used to think. And I know people close to me, in fact, who think that way. But now I've been made aware that Jesus expects us to be ready, and we can't be ready if we're not watching and waiting and expecting his return in our lifetime. So anyway, all that to say is that the story of the Exodus was documented so that we would have a pattern, and that it would be a pattern that would give us instruction and warning upon whom the ends of the world are come. So when Jesus does fulfill his promise of returning, there will be some people who are ready, who are waiting and watching and ready for his return, because they've been watching and understanding the pattern that God has given us. So before we get started, because what I want to do today is really look at God's plan of redemption. I'm going to put it up here in a nutshell, but then we're going to go back to Exodus chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and we're going to look at the details we're given in the entire pattern, because even the foundation of God's redemptive story for the nation of Israel gives us clues for our redemptive story. And not only does it give us clues, it really builds up a case for this idea that you can better understand God's plan of redemption for you and for me by going back and looking at the pattern. Because we see all of the connections between the Exodus story, including the foundation of it, right, which is the birth of Moses and God hearing the cries of the people and the people being enslaved and all of that. We can connect all that stuff to a timeline of Christ, to his first coming, to his second coming, to the end times, to the prophecies. We can connect it all very, very apparently, very, very obvious connections that we can make that just build up a bigger and better case that this is the blueprint of God's plan of redemption, the Exodus story. It's the blueprint. It's the pattern. Okay, so with all that being said, what I want to do really quick is just write something down here, and then I'm probably going to erase it because I want to use this space for today's study. God's plan of redemption for the nation of Israel, documented in the book of Exodus. The way I see it is it starts out with God hearing the cries of the people, okay? We're told that he heard the cries of the people, the groanings, the prayers, the outcry, the suffering, the affliction. He heard it and he saw it, okay? And what he did was he chose an intercessor. Okay, we have step 1, we have step 2. He heard their cries and he responded. He chose an intercessor, and of course it was Moses. The next thing he did was he poured out his wrath. Okay, and in this story it was on Egypt. Okay, and by the way, this is God's plan of redemption, and one thing that's required of redemption is a ransom. The Bible tells us that God poured his wrath on Egypt, and that Egypt was the ransom. They were the ones that paid the price in order for the nation of Israel to be set free. Okay, God is also redeeming you and me, and Jesus paid the price in order for you and me to be set free. Okay. So step 3 was God's wrath in the form of those plagues, the final plague being the death of the firstborn. Okay. And in the morning of the death of that, all of those firstborn people dying, God's firstborn son, the nation of Israel, God's firstborn son had victory over death. Okay? Remember, in the night of the Passover, they killed the lamb, they painted the blood over the door, and they were told to stay in the house because God was going to sweep through the whole country and kill all the firstborn unless they had that covering, the atoning blood. And that's what happened. And in the morning, there was weeping and wailing. People were crying. There was death in all the land. If you were born first in your family, you were dead. Even the animals, the firstborn of the animals, died in the night. And here was the nation of Israel, God's firstborn son, right? God's plan for the nation of Israel. That's his firstborn. He called the whole nation his firstborn son. And over here, God's plan of redemption for you and for me, we are also God's firstborn son, right? If we suffer with Christ, we will be glorified with Christ. Okay, so if we're connected to Jesus, we abide in him, we repent of our sin, we are faithful to God, we love his appearing, right? Then we can be found worthy to be called a firstborn son of God, which means we will share in the inheritance of Jesus Christ. Who gets to share in the inheritance of Jesus Christ? Well, it's his adopted brothers and sisters, who, by the way, will become the bride one day. That makes sense to share. When you talk about, parents dying and leaving everything to the kids and they split everything up, if there's 3 of you, split everything up 3 ways or whatever. But there's also a bridegroom sharing his inheritance with his bride, right? When that bridegroom receives the inheritance from his father, he shares it with his bride. Okay. All right. So victory over death, God's firstborn son, in the morning after the night of the Passover. The computer's telling me something. I don't know if I need to respond to that or not. If you're watching this live, would you go ahead and just type in the chat, just give a thumbs up or something like that to let me know that you can see me and hear me okay? That would be great. I would appreciate it. I'm just going to keep going until I see some kind of indication that you guys can hear and see me okay. Okay, so in the God's plan of redemption for the nation of Israel, his firstborn son, God heard their cries. He chose an intercessor, which was Moses. He poured out his wrath on Egypt, and God's firstborn son had victory over death that morning, where every other firstborn person died. Now, I used to think that it was just the firstborn of the nation of Israel that had victory over death in the morning, but it just occurred to me this week that it was the whole nation of Israel. They were God's firstborn son. So if it hadn't been for that blood, they all would have died. Right? When God came through, when the destroyer came through and killed all the firstborn, the whole nation of Israel would have died had it not been for that atoning blood. Not just the individuals who were like literally born first. Likewise, if you're watching live and and there's connectivity issues, would you write connectivity issues in the chat? I think there's one person watching this live right now. I see. It doesn't tell me if anybody's watching live. I only see that I have 1 thumbs up. So I'm going to assume that somebody is watching live and that you can see and hear me. Okay. All right. So the next thing in God's plan of redemption after this nation of Israel had victory over death was they began to march out. Right? They began to, they stepped out of their houses and they started marching. They left Egypt. They began their path of redemption. It really began, here in the night of the Passover, but the very next morning, as soon as the sun rose, they They were poised and ready. God told them to be ready. They were dressed and ready to walk out the door as soon as the sun came up. Okay, so I'll say they began their redemptive hike, right? And remember, this is an 8-day week. And we know this because God, number one, he says redemption takes place on day 8. Okay, over here on the 8th day, they sing their song of redemption over here on the 8th day. They began here on day 1. When the sun came up after the night of the Passover, the destroyer came through and killed all the firstborn. And they had a week here. This is 1 week. We know that, number one, because redemption takes place on the 8th day, and they sing the song of redemption. We also know that because after this was all said and done, God instructed the nation of Israel that every year you're going to memorialize this week where you woke up and walked out of your homes and walked out of Egypt. You walked for a week. On the 7th day, you crossed through the Red Sea. You came out on the other side. All of your enemies had been defeated in the Red Sea, and you sang your song of redemption on the 8th day. And God instructed the nation that every year you're going to celebrate this story of your redemption by memorializing it with a week-long feast of the Lord. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's where they walked for a week and they could only eat unleavened bread because they didn't have time to raise their loaves of bread, right? They just had to take everything and go. And so they ate unleavened bread during that week, and every year after that on that anniversary during that week. So this hike out of Egypt was a week. And that's really important for you and me. This is one of kind of the little clues that fills in the blanks when we get over here and we start looking at our redemptive story, right? By looking at the story of Revelation. The story of Revelation doesn't really indicate anything about, us being changed on day 1 and being escorted up and out and into heaven on day 8. But when we look to the pattern, what we see is the people, their life began anew because the atoning blood of the Lamb. They got up that morning and they started their new life. They started hiking out of Egypt. And when they crossed through that Red Sea and God defeated all of their enemies that wanted to kill them, they came out of the other side and they sang their song of redemption before the Lord. Okay. So this does, I believe, tell us something about your redemption and my redemption as followers of Christ, that we too, our life is going to begin anew on a day 1, and we will go before the Lord and sing our song of redemption, just like it says in Revelation, singing their song of redemption before the Lord. I believe it'll happen on that 8th day, right? And back here on day 1 will be our being made new. We've already been made new in the spirit, but we'll be made new in the body. That's our resurrection moment. That's that twinkling of an eye where the dead and the living will be changed all at the same time, and they will have victory over death, Paul says. Victory over death, because we will be made immortal. So they sing their song of redemption. And the other thing is, God, in this timeline, he says, I have come down. He was talking to Moses in the burning bush, which we'll look at that next week. I have come down so that I can take my people up and out of Israel and into the promised land. But what actually happened? He brought them up and out, and they ended up in the desert here for 40 years. Okay. And then they went into the land of milk and honey. You see that? Land of milk and honey. So we've got this 40-year kind of what I like to call a pre-destination location, the desert. Okay. They had to stay in a predestination location. That is, God said, I want to bring you up and out of Egypt and into the land of milk and honey. And that's not what happened. Because of their unfaithfulness, they had to stay in the desert for 40 years. We haven't gotten to that part of the story yet, but that's what happens. They had to stay in the desert for 40 years as a punishment, so to speak, for their unfaithfulness. And so it's my belief that if that's the pattern for these guys and their story of redemption, then that's going to be the pattern for us too. And it's actually what we see in Revelation, because what we see in Revelation is that we sing our song of redemption, and then the 1,000-year, when the 3.5-year reign of the beast ends, the 1,000 years of Jesus begins. And that is our predestination location. The day of God doesn't begin until after. Okay, so let's just apply this to your plan of redemption, to my plan of redemption. Let's look at it. God hears the cries of the people. He chooses an intercessor. And of course, it was Jesus. He chose Jesus to intercede on our behalf. He became our intercessor. God sent him down to become flesh and to tabernacle among us and to fulfill the will of God for us, so that we could what? So that we could be a part of his family, and that he could be our father, and that we could all be together one day in that great day of God. So he chose an intercessor, which in this case was Jesus. And the next thing is God's wrath is poured out. When does God's wrath pour out? During Christ's first coming. Because obviously at his second coming, and we can look at this and apply it to both part 1 and part 2 of Jesus's coming. It is a two-parter. There's the first coming and there's the second coming, and we can apply this whole plan of redemption to both. But just stick with me for a minute and let's just think about this. God chooses an intercessor, Jesus. He comes down, he becomes flesh, he dwells among us, and then God's wrath pours out. Where does God's wrath pour out during Jesus's first coming? Does anybody know the answer? God poured out his wrath on Christ on the cross. Christ was there on the cross bearing our sin. And what is the punishment for sin? It's God's judgment. It's God's condemnation. And it's death. I mean, in a sense, the other day I was watching this video. I like to watch videos where Christians go into the streets and interview people. And a lot of times they're interviewing secular people, atheist people, very, very angry people, very, very anti-God people. And they say really, really horrible things sometimes, like, don't you know God killed Jesus? God killed his own son. And you think, oh, that's so blasphemous. But you know what? The truth is that Jesus, he gave up his life for us, and he hung there on the cross and bore our sin, knowing that he was going to take the cup of the wrath of God. That was what he prayed for in the nights before his crucifixion. If there be any other way, Lord, than receiving thy cup. The cup is talked about in Revelation as being the cup of the wrath of God, the fullness of his indignation. It's God's judgment being poured out. God poured all of the condemnation and the judgment that we earned from our own sin. He poured it out on Christ. So in this timeline, where in the story of the Exodus, God poured out his wrath on the nation of Egypt, who was the ransom, they paid the price in order for Egypt to be set free. In our timeline, the wrath of God was poured out on his son on the cross, because he was the ransom in order for you and I to be set free. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's just like, but anyway, God poured out his wrath on Jesus there on the cross. And then the next thing that happens in terms of this timeline of God's redemptive plan is God's firstborn son has victory over death. There at the cross began your path to redemption, my path to redemption, because of what Jesus did at the cross. Just like for these guys, their path of redemption, their pathway to redemption began when they painted that blood over their house. They were covered by the atoning blood. You and I as individuals have been extended an invitation to receive this atoning blood. And if we accept it and choose to live our lives with Jesus and for Jesus and about Jesus, then we're covered. We're covered by the blood, right? And we have victory over death. And it begins for individuals when we make that choice. We have victory over death. But it'll happen in real life. It'll happen in real time when that's fulfilled. That is at the resurrection moment, in the twinkling of an eye, when we receive our resurrection body. that's when the victory over death happens. Like right now, we're moving toward it. We're on our redemptive hike towards actually having victory over death. That is living in a body that's broken free from the curse, a body that lives forever. Okay. But the moment we choose Jesus and we're made new in the spirit, we begin that path of redemption. And in a sense, we're victorious over death because we've already drank of the living water of Christ, which leads to everlasting life. Okay. All right. So the firstborn, God's firstborn son in the Exodus story, they have victory over death when they wake up in the morning and all the firstborn are dead except them. They had victory over death because of the atoning blood of the Lamb. You and I will have victory over death when our resurrection bodies are made new in the twinkling of an eye. But we're on the path to redemption here and now, as long as we've said yes to the call. Okay, next up, number 5, they began their redemptive hike, right? So they stepped out of their house and just started heading out of Egypt. They began that 8-day week that would end on that 8th day where they sing their song of redemption. For you and me, we're in our 8-day week right now from the moment we say yes to the call, figuratively, right? But one day we will literally be in our 8-day week where we will literally have been made new in the body, right? We will go through that 7-day consecration phase that priests go through in order to become a official priest, right? And then on the 8th day, the 8th day is the day of redemption. That's, I believe, when we see these groups singing their song of redemption before the Lord in heaven in the book of Revelation, I believe they're doing it on the 8th day, which means they need to back up to day 1, and that's when they're made new. That's when they receive their resurrection bodies. All right, so we've began our redemptive hike, so to speak, but when we are changed in a twinkling of an eye, we won't just figuratively be on our path to redemption. We will literally be taking that week-long path to redemption, where on the 8th day, Jesus is going to escort us into heaven, where we will sing our song of redemption. And then on the 8th day, Israel sang their song of redemption. They stayed in the wilderness for 40 years. For you and for me, we will go into heaven and sing our song of redemption. Okay. And when Jesus begins his 1,000-year reign, which will be at the end of the 3.5-year reign of the beast, when the beast is thrown into the lake of fire, Jesus begins his 1,000 years. His priest kings will rule and reign with him for 1,000 years. That is our predestination location. We have to fulfill that before we can enter into the land of milk and honey, which is eternity. It is the day of God. It is when the New Jerusalem comes down with God in it. And people are invited into the New Jerusalem to drink of the water and eat of the tree of life and experiencing everlasting God, with God living literally in their midst. I will be your God. You will be my children. So in the Exodus timeline, they sing their song of redemption, and then they have to stay in that predestination location before they go into the land of milk and honey and lay claim to their inheritance. Now, remember, there are 2 inheritances, so to speak, in the Exodus timeline. There was the inheritance for the whole nation of Israel, and it was the land. And then there was the inheritance for the priests, which was God himself. God himself said, I will be your inheritance. And so the priest is a type or symbolic for the bride. Remember, because the first bride was built. That was Eve. She was built. She was hidden in Adam all along, and God built her from that living bone. The priesthood is being built with living stones, and the priesthood is hidden in Christ, hidden with Christ in God. And so God, he built that first bride. He's building this bride. It's a bride for his son, Jesus. And at the end, those people that make up the nations are going to lay claim to the land of milk and honey. They're going to live on the new earth with God in their midst, just like the original Abrahamic covenant promise, the everlasting covenant. I will be your God. You will be your people. I will live in your midst. It's going to be fulfilled at the end of the 1,000-year reign when those nations make up the new earth and God comes down and lives in the midst of the nations. They are going to take their inheritance, which is the new earth. But the priest kings will inherit Jesus. They're not going to inherit the new earth. They're going to inherit Christ himself. They're going to receive Christ himself as their bridegroom. What that looks like, what that means, I have no idea. But if I were to speculate, I would say that, Jesus is going to receive everything from his heavenly Father. He's going to share it with his bride. And now the new heaven, the newly made heaven, has been vacated. And I'm thinking the newly made heaven is going to be God's wedding gift to Jesus and his bride. And so the bride will claim her inheritance, which is Christ, and everything that Christ wants to share with her. And the people that make up the nations will claim their inheritance, which is the new earth. And they will live in it with God living at the heart of the people. That is the story, the pattern, and that is how it translates to you and to me. Now, what I want to do is take a step back, so to speak, and look at the details that we find in the Exodus story, beginning with Exodus 1. Okay, Exodus 1 is the foundation of the Exodus story. Okay, and what I've been doing all week is really just kind of going through the verses verse by verse. There's 3 or 4 chapters to this story. It would take me several weeks to really go through it verse by verse. So I'm just going to kind of paraphrase. You guys go back and read it for yourself. And if I make any errors, forgive me, but I'm going to just kind of be paraphrasing it as I go and writing down the clues in terms of God's plan of redemption for Israel and how that translates to God's plan of redemption for you and for me. And I've got notes there. I've got notes here. Come on, focus. Okay. All right. So how do I want to do this? I'm going to set down my phone because I don't even think I need it right now at the moment. And I'm going to grab my notes. And when we start in Exodus chapter 1, we're introduced to the Pharaoh. And we know that the nation of Israel lives in Egypt because of what we just read about how they got there. Joseph invited them in to provide for them their needs during the 7 years of famine. And then they just never left. And now some time has gone by. That original Pharaoh that was buddy-buddy with Joseph and kind of a good guy, he's long gone. He's dead. They have a new Pharaoh now. And what we see with this new Pharaoh, let's come over here. My pen's drying out, so I gotta, oh shoot, what's happening? Oh, darn it. I'm having connectivity issues. I apologize. I've been having issues all week. Okay, so we're introduced to the Pharaoh. Now, the Pharaoh, in my estimation, is very clear, is that he, in this story, in the Exodus story, is a type of Satan. Okay, so let's put him over here. Why do I say that? Well, what we learn about this Pharaoh is that he's powerful. He has wealth. He has reach or influence. He's the king of the kind of the biggest known area, most affluent area of the known world. Even if you lived in further Middle East or in China or other places, you would have heard of Egypt. You would have heard of the Pharaoh. You would have great admiration, respect, and fear for this guy. He was a big deal. Okay. He had great power, wealth, and reach. And the thing about Pharaoh that we learn about him is that he wanted population control. Okay, why do I say that? Well, what we see in the story is that he looks out over the land and he sees these Hebrews that have been living peacefully in the land of Egypt for a long, long time. And he says, they've really grown. There's a lot of them. If they choose to side with our enemies and revolt against us, they'll defeat us. And so we need to do something about that. And his answer to the problem was population control. And so what he did is he went to the Hebrew midwives and he commanded them that anytime a baby is born, a Hebrew baby, if it was a boy, they were to be killed. If it was a girl, it was fine, but if it was a boy, it was to be killed. And then what ended up happening was these midwives, they're like, well, we're not going to do that. And so they didn't. And Pharaoh, one day, he's looking again, he's like, gosh, these Hebrews seem to really still be, doing well. They're thriving, they're growing. I thought I put an end to that. I thought I controlled that population. And so then he puts out an edict to the whole country. If you see a Hebrew baby boy under the age of 2, I believe, you're to kill him. He instructed the whole country to kill Hebrew baby boys under the age of 2. So that was his answer to this, problem that he perceived of interfering with his power. Okay, so the Pharaoh, like Satan, he wants dominion. Okay, he wants dominion. And that's true over here too. That's been the truth since the day one when he entered into the garden and deceived Adam and Eve. It's because he wants dominion, but God gave dominion to people, and Satan is an angel. So anyway, we start to see the similarities here because with Satan, whether you realize it or not, all throughout history, Satan is the prince of the power of the air. So God gives him quite a bit of reign and reach, but God reins him in and reels him back from time to time. He allows him to do certain things and not certain things. But he's the prince of the power of the air, the air, which means he does have the ability to speak and to deceive, to whisper and to lie and to deceive. He also has this harlot working for him and running the whole show. She sits upon many waters. She's infiltrated all things. There is a system in play. It's systematic throughout the whole world. It's everywhere, right? Religion, entertainment, government, military, healthcare, all of it. Everything has been infiltrated by the harlot because Satan wants dominion. And he can whisper and speak and influence and deceive, but he can't just come down and wipe us all out and take dominion. God doesn't let him do that. But God does give him a certain amount of freedom. He allows him to deceive. And so all throughout history, let's just think about this for a second. I was thinking about this week. I was kind of asking the question. So over here in the pattern, we see the Pharaoh exerting population control. First, by trying to get the Hebrew people themselves to kill their own people, right? When he told the midwives to kill the babies. And when that didn't work, he told the whole nation to kill these babies. Okay? And it says that even in affliction, their numbers grew. So even after Pharaoh tried to create this population control, their numbers, they weren't stunted or, halted. They grew. They continued to thrive and to grow, even though they were enslaved. And even though the Pharaoh told his soldiers and his people to kill the babies, they continued to grow. And so I asked the question, how do we translate that to our timeline, so to speak, in terms of Satan, in terms of him deceiving and trying to not just control the population, but to destroy God's people. And so I was thinking about this and I was trying to think of just, examples off the top of my head. And of course, the Holocaust comes to mind. I'm not going to write all this down, but just bear with me because I thought of several actually examples. The Holocaust comes to mind where God's people are being destroyed. But let's go back to even modern history where this country was being established and we went to war with the British in order to gain our independence. This country was like 95 to, I just did like AI searches to kind of gather these statistics. This country, when we fought the British for our independence, was 95 to 98% Christian, Protestant, Catholic, Lutheran. They were followers of Jesus. They were believers. And many of our enemies were also Christian nations, Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, whatever. They were followers of Christ. And Satan worms his way in and deceives the brethren into killing each other. To do what? To kill God's people and to control the population. And so really, this is what we see with all war, if you think about it, because there at that war, it was Christians killing Christians, deaths on all sides of the world war, believers, members of the brethren. Fast forward to the Civil War, the North and the South here in this country. Again, the country was predominantly Christian. And Satan convinced these people that the way forward, the way to out of these issues and the way towards getting what you want is war. And so brother against brother were killing one another. And you had deaths on both sides, believers killing each other because of deception. Fast forward to World War I. Even during World War I, according to my AI sources, 90 to 95% of this country was Christian. 90 to 95%. And so all of those soldiers went to war during World War I, and they were battling against, brothers in Germany, and it was a world war. So you had the French and you had all these different countries that were Christian countries. And they were killing each other. Why? Because Satan convinced them that that's what they needed to do. And in so by doing, Satan didn't come down and wipe out Christians. He got them to do it for him by killing each other. Fast forward to World War II, same thing. The number of Christians diminishes a little bit. Now, maybe 90 to, around 85 to 85 to 90% of the country was Christian during World War II. And it's the same thing. It's all of these different countries, many of them predominantly Christian, and they're killing each other because of deceit, because Satan wants dominion, and because the Christians keep coming out, right? And just like over here, where we see, even in the sight of, even in the presence of the Pharaoh's attempt to control their population and wipe out the children of God, they continued to grow. They persevered and they overcame and they continue to grow. And where are we today in the year 2025? Are there any Christians in the world? Well, of course they are. Now in this country, Christianity is on the decline, and it is so in many many first world countries. And I think that's because the more comfortable people get with technology and luxury and freedom, and we're more easily deceived. We more easily succumb to the lies. Because when you're afflicted, like these people were, you're more likely to reach out to God and to trust in God and to cry out to God, to depend on God. But when life's going pretty good, you're less likely. Okay. So what we have here is the Pharaoh being a type of Satan. The Pharaoh has power. He has reach. He has influence. He wants to control the population. He wants to kill God's people. He wants dominion, and that's all a type of exactly what Satan is doing and has been doing all along. Now, I just gave you some modern day examples, but this goes all the way back. This goes all the way back, where Satan deceives people into killing other believers. Okay. All right. So next up, we have the birth of Moses in this story. We have the birth of Moses. Okay. And it actually parallels the birth of Jesus, because for a number of reasons. Actually, one, Moses' life was at risk when he was born. Jesus' life was at risk when he was born. Two, Moses, when he was born a Hebrew, which, remember, they were slaves, so they're kind of considered at the bottom of the class system there in Egypt. But he was sent down the river in a little ark, and this princess, a member of the royal family, scooped him up and adopted him, raised him in the castle as a royal member of their family, right? So he kind of went from pauper to prince, so to speak. He was born a Hebrew, but he was raised in the royal family. He was a member of the royal family, even though he was born a Hebrew, which technically that's awesome because you're a firstborn son of God. But as far as, what people thought of the Hebrews, they just thought, oh, they're a bunch of slaves. They're a bunch of low-class nobodies. Same thing over here with Christ. He was actually born in Bethlehem to Mary and Joseph. We know that Joseph was a carpenter, which was economically, it was a trade that wasn't considered, they certainly weren't considered middle class or upper class or elite or wealthy or royal or anything like that. They were just average, everyday, normal people, Mary and Joseph. And one thing we know about them, that when they went to celebrate the feast of the Lord, they took 2 turtle doves. Now in the Bible, God says that when you come to the feast of the Lord, you're to bring a perfect, spotless, innocent baby lamb to offer up. But if you can't afford it, you can bring 2 turtle doves instead because they were cheaper. How this worked was you either raised your own perfect lamb and brought it to sacrifice it, but if you didn't, you could go buy one, and they weren't cheap. But 2 turtle doves were, because they're more plenteous, they procreate faster, you could go buy 2 turtle doves. It was cheaper than a lamb. We know that they took 2 turtle doves. So Jesus was born into this family that wasn't anything special on the outside, but we know, one, that Jesus is he's the Son of God. That makes him about as royal as it gets. But also Mary and Joseph can trace their bloodline back to King David. So even, in physical form, Jesus was born into a royal family. So Jesus, in that sense, both of those senses, he was royal. Next, we're told at the birth of Moses, we're told his birth story, and then it goes fast forward to his adulthood. With one exception, there's one mention of how, at one point he was weaned, and then his biological mother took him to the princess, and she adopted him and raised him in her own household. So we're given one little instance of his childhood, but other than that, we're given a pretty decent birth story, and then it fast forwards to, and then Moses was an adult. Okay. Over here, we have the same thing with Christ. We have his birth story where we're told quite a bit. We have one little story about his childhood where they're brought into Jerusalem for the feast of the Lord. And then when they leave, they're like, where's Jesus? And they can't find him. They realize they left without him and he was back at the temple. So other than that, we have a lot of detail about his birth. And then it fast forward to his adulthood or his ministry. So they have that in common as well. All right, so when we get over here in the Exodus story, when we get to Moses being an adult, see that? When we get to this part of the story, let me look at my notes really quick. It tells us that he goes out. So remember, he was living in the castle. He was a royal member of he was the elite top of the caste system, whatever. He was royal. Moses was. He was like the grandson of the Pharaoh by adoption. So one day he decides he wants to go out and see his people. And what we're told in the Bible is he goes out and he looks on his people, the Hebrews, and he sees one of his brethren, another Hebrew man, being beaten by an Egyptian soldier. And he looks around and nobody's watching. So he kills this Egyptian soldier and he buries him in the sand. Okay. And what we're told is that he goes out and he sees the burdens of his people. Okay. Now over here, when we have Jesus and his adult story, we don't have a connection where he sees one of his brethren being beaten and he looks around and kills the guy who beats him. But what we do see is we see Jesus talking about the burdens of his people. Jesus sees the burdens of his people, his brethren. And what does he say about it? Let me pull it up in the Bible really quick. I'm going to read it. Oops. I'm going to get into the right spot here. Okay. All right. The reason I wanted to pull this up is because it's so beautiful and I want to read it, make sure I get it right. But basically, Jesus he also sees the burdens of his people, right? He came down, he became flesh, he tabernacled among us. He lived among humans. He became a human, he lived among humans, and he saw our burdens. And what did he say and do about it? Well, basically, he said, "Come unto me, all those who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your soul." Rest for your soul, in order to overcome your burdens, right? Come unto me, I will give you rest for your soul over your burdens. Okay, this is found in Matthew 11, verse 28. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Okay. Moses went out and saw the burdens of his people, and he responded by killing the guy who was afflicting one of his brethren. Jesus comes along and sees the burdens of people, and he responds by saying, "Come, follow me, abide with me, for my burden is light. Take on my burden because it's light. I will give you rest." Okay, so over here you've got a group of people that are desperate for rest, desperate for liberation, freedom, right? And over here, this people were praying as well, and God heard their prayers. He sent his son, and Jesus comes along and says, "Come to me. Come to me." So Jesus sees the burdens, and he says, "Follow me," right? "For my burden is light, and I will give you rest." Isn't that wonderful? Okay, let's move on. So the next thing that happens in this story is Moses goes out again to look upon his people and to be in the, remember, all he knew was life in the palace. Now he's going out in and out, kind of like Aladdin. Remember, he would, like, or not Aladdin, but who was it? It was the girl. She would go out and be among the people because she got tired and bored of just living in the palace all the time. So she would go out incognito and be among the people. Anyway, I think that's what Moses is doing. He's going out and being in the midst of his people. And now this time he sees two of his brethren fighting. And he says to the one guy who's hitting the other guy, "Why are you hitting your brother? Your brothers. It's bad enough you're being persecuted by Egypt and you're going to strike each other." He says, "Why are you hitting your brother?" And the guy responds to him by saying, "What are you, my prince and my lord? Are you going to kill me like you killed that soldier?" And then Moses kind of freaks out because he realizes he thought nobody knew. He realizes now everybody knows. Like, the word is out. And then it goes on to say that Moses knows, and he orders the death of Moses, or the Pharaoh knows. He orders the death of Moses because, I mean, apparently the punishment for killing an Egyptian soldier was death, which kind of tells you this Pharaoh never really liked Moses in the first place, as he's ordering him to be killed. But so it says that Moses, feared for his life, and he fled. He left Egypt and he went to Midian, I think, and he sat down by a well. That's kind of how it all wraps up, and then it moves on to the next part of the story. But what I want to say by that is, when Moses saw one of his brethren hitting one of his brethren, he said, "Why? Why are you striking your brethren?" He asks the question, why? And over here, let's see, 4. Over here, Jesus answers the question. And he answers it. We see the answer in John 13, verse 34. Okay. Moses goes out among his brethren. He sees them fighting each other, and he's like, "Why are you fighting each other?" Which tells us something about Moses and what he's thinking. He's thinking, you guys should get along. You guys should support one another. You should be there for one another. You should love one another. It's bad enough you've got the affliction coming in from the outside. You guys need to be tight on the inside. You need to love one another. And he says, why? Why are you fighting? Why are you striking your brother? And Jesus comes along, and he sees the people having it out, duking it out with each other, the brethren. And what does he tell them? He says, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. Jesus answered the question by telling them, commanding them, love one another. All right. So up next, we see Moses flee, and we see him sit down by a well. Do we ever see Jesus sit down by a well? Well, yes, there's a very prominent, popular story in the New Testament where Jesus sits down by a well and he has a long conversation with a Samaritan woman. So immediately when I see that, all this talk about, Pharaoh wants to kill Moses and he's fleeing for his life and he leaves Egypt and he ends up in Midian and he sits down by a well. It's like, okay, for me, like my little feelers are going off when he sits down by a well because it's not pertinent to the story. Why is the author wasting space with this detail? And of course, the story is going to go on. He's about to meet his wife. He's about to meet his wife, and he's about to start a new life. New wife, new life. He sits down by a well. He's about to meet his wife, and he's about to start his new life. Well, when Jesus sits down by a well, okay, he has a talk with a Samaritan woman. Now you have to understand something about Samaritan. I don't know if that's spelled right. About this Samaritan woman is that the Samaritans were neither accepted by Jews nor Gentiles. That's how they weren't the bottom of the hierarchy or the class system. They were on the outside of it. They were considered neither Jew nor Gentile. Nobody wanted to claim them. That's how disgusting and awful. If you were walking down the street and you saw a Samaritan coming your way, you either go back and take a different road, or you'd really go out of your way to not go near that unclean person. And of course, we have the story of the Good Samaritan, which is where a man was robbed and beaten and laid on the ground, dying. And the religious leaders walked by and different people walked by and they didn't want to help this person. But a Samaritan came along and did help that person. He did everything right. All right. So while the Jews and Gentiles believed that the Samaritans were the scum of the earth, we understand through the teaching of Jesus that that's not the case. Okay. That there's goodness. There can be goodness in these so-called Samaritans. Now, Jesus has a talk at the well with the Samaritan woman. And in fact, when the disciples return and they see him talking to this Samaritan woman, we're told that they thought in their minds, they didn't say anything out loud or question Jesus, but they thought to themselves, what in the world is he doing? Why is he talking not only to a Samaritan, but to a woman? Which I think the emphasis was on the Samaritan part of it because, they walked and talked and lived with women and didn't think of them as low class or scum of the earth or anything like that. So I think the emphasis was the fact that she was a Samaritan woman and they were like, what in the world is Jesus doing talking to this Samaritan woman? But anyway, he has a long conversation with her. And I want to point out two things that he says because those two things actually very much connect us to this. New wife, new life. Did you know that? I'm about to tell you. Okay, so the first thing that Jesus talks about is he tells this Samaritan woman that if you drink of my water, you'll never be thirsty again. It's living water and it leads to everlasting life. Okay, so he talks about the living water. Jesus tells the Samaritan woman about this living water that leads to everlasting life. Who gets to drink the living water that leads to everlasting life? Well, it's anyone that accepts the invitation, says yes to the call, right? Becomes part of the chosen and then proceeds to live out their life as the faithful. Okay? The people who drink the living water are the people who choose. They say yes to the call and they choose to drink the living water. And thus begins the path to redemption or the path to everlasting life. Partaking of what Jesus has to offer. Abiding in Christ, consuming Christ, drinking of his living water, receiving from him all that he has to offer, putting our hope in him, putting our trust in him, putting our faith in him. Jesus told this Samaritan woman, if you drink my water, you will never be thirsty again. It's living water that leads to everlasting life. The living water leads to everlasting life. Everlasting life. That looks really weird. Looks like Ella. Everlasting life. Everlasting life. The living water of Christ leads to everlasting life. The other thing he told her, he actually had a pretty long conversation. They talked about a lot of things, but he told her that a day is coming and is now where people will have the opportunity to worship God in spirit and in truth. And what he says is that, did I bring up the scripture? I'll try to paraphrase it as best as I can. No, I didn't bring it up. He basically tells her that the time is coming and is now where you can worship in spirit and truth. He says, God is spirit. And because of Jesus, people are going to be able to worship in spirit and truth. Now, what does that mean? Worship in spirit and truth. Well, the spirit is out, obviously the spirit of the living God, and the truth is Jesus himself. So he was sharing with her this new thing that was about to happen where people could be indwelt with the spirit of the living God and with Christ himself, and they could connect through that with God himself and be one, be all a part of the same community, be one, which means you'll be able to worship without all the rigmarole. And when I say rigmarole, I'm talking about the rigmarole that God instructed the nation of Israel how to worship. They had to be ceremonially clean. They had to bring the perfect offering. They had to go to the temple. They had to go to the priest. They had to go to an intercessor. They had to do everything just right in order to be right with God. And they had to do it ongoing. It wasn't never a one and done thing like Christ at the cross. It was a one and done. Jesus was telling this woman that a day is coming and is now come where you can worship in spirit and truth. And I would imagine that she got really excited about that, considering she was a Samaritan woman and was told, you're no good. Now this man is telling her she can worship God in spirit and in truth. I don't know if she would have fully understood what that meant, but I kind of have an idea of what it means, and I think it's incredible that God made a way for people to be able to go before the Lord without all of the rigmarole. I can just go before the Lord. I can bare my soul. I can worship. I can offer up spiritual sacrifices of thanksgiving all day, all night, any night. I can ask for things. I can invoke the powerful, mighty name of Jesus over my life and over other people's lives. This idea that God lives inside of us is so much bigger, I think, than any of us realize, which is fine. It's so much bigger than any of us realize. But so Jesus was sharing these things with the Samaritan woman, and it's all a pattern of this. Because one day, Jesus will unite with his bride, his new wife, and he'll start a new life with her. And it's all about this. It's about her receiving the living water that leads to everlasting life. And it's about worshiping in spirit of the living God, and in truth, Jesus Christ, being brought together as one, where there's no need of a high priest. There's no need of a tabernacle. There's no need of a blood sacrifice. All of that passes away because of Jesus, our bridegroom. He is for the bride, and the bride is for her. This stuff is for the bride and the bridegroom. This everlasting life, this living water, this worshiping in spirit and truth, it's for believers. It's for the bride. Okay, let's move on. So, let me check and see what time it is really quick. Oh, yeah, okay. Let's do a couple more and then I got to get going. So we'll make this part 1 and then we'll finish up next week. So the next thing we see in the Exodus story is we see God, he hears the cries of the people, the groans of the people, the outcry of the people, the prayers of the people, the persecution of the people, the affliction of the people, the nation of Israel, the enslaved nation of Israel. He comes down, he's going to come down in a burning bush. He's going to talk to Moses and he's going to say, I hear the cries of the people. And he's going to say that he remembers he's going to remember the covenant, the everlasting covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay. So what do I want to say about this? He hears the cries and he remembers the everlasting covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, over here, once again, of course, God hears. He hears our cries. Now here, it's mentioned over and over and over in this story that God hears the cries of the people. We don't see before the first coming of Christ in the scriptures that God heard the cries of the people and therefore sent his son. At least I can't find it. We do see several examples in the Bible that tell us that God hears our cries. This is a really good example. Job heard the cries, or God heard the cries of Job and responded in that story. And in Christ himself, he would go off to a remote place. He would pray to God, and God would hear his, it says that Jesus would pray fervently with tears and with cries. And of course, God heard him. So God hears our cries. And a lot of times, I know since I've been doing this study, I will wrap up my prayer with, Lord, hear our cries. Because this is what God said he heard from his nation, his firstborn son. He heard their cries. Okay. So God hear our cries. He always hears our cries. God hears. When it came time to send his son, he was hearing the cries. When it came time for Jesus to begin his ministry, God was hearing the cries of the people, and he was responding. Okay, he was responding. And so over here we see God, saying, he heard the cries of the people. He remembered the everlasting covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the everlasting covenant. So some people think the everlasting covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has already been fulfilled and kind of put to rest. I don't believe that, because it's an everlasting covenant. Yes, facets of it were fulfilled, like Abraham had a son, the nation of Israel was born, they marched into the promised land and took claim to their inheritance. So facets of it have been fulfilled, but the main crux of the everlasting covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is thus: I will be your God and you will be my children. That's it. I will be your God and you will be my children. The people entered into an agreement to that agreement. God entered into that agreement. And the fulfillment of that has yet to come. We see it fulfilled in the book of Revelation in the final chapters. We see God fulfilling that facet of the everlasting covenant. God remembers the everlasting covenant here. And over here, it's Jesus that remembers, not only remembers, but he renews the everlasting covenant. And this was at the Last Supper when he said, this is my blood and of the covenant, and this is my body broken for you. Drink, eat in remembrance of me. He was renewing God's everlasting covenant in his blood. The original covenant was agreed upon in blood of goats and lambs, or goats and rams, or whatever. He renewed it in his blood. In the night before his crucifixion at the Last Supper, he broke the bread, he shared the cup, and he said, this is my blood of the new covenant. He wasn't creating a brand new covenant to replace the old covenant. He was reawakening the everlasting covenant. I will be your God and you will be my people. And he was taking authority of it through his blood. The agreement was now being made between individuals and God through the blood of Christ, as opposed to an entire nation and God through the blood of goats and rams. Jesus renewed the everlasting covenant at the Last Supper in his blood, and he told his people to drink the wine and eat the bread in remembrance of me. Okay? The sacrificial Lamb of God, whose blood takes away the sins of the world, if you so choose to accept that free gift. Jesus renewed the everlasting covenant. Okay, next up in this account, this foundational backstory of the redemptive, plan of the nation of Israel, we see the mention of Moses being a shepherd. Okay. He was there working for his father-in-law as a shepherd. He was out in the fields when God visited him in the burning bush. Now, was Jesus ever a shepherd? Does the Bible ever talk about him as working as a shepherd as his profession? No, it doesn't. But what did Jesus say about himself? He actually says, I am the good shepherd. Let me pull that up really quick. It's found in John 10. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. Jesus was talking, he was comparing himself to a good shepherd who gives his life for sheep. A good shepherd would fight a bear or a wolf to defend his sheep. He would put his life on the line and risk his life for the life of his sheep. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, verse 14, and I know my sheep and am known of mine. I know them, they know me. And that's the case of a shepherd. He would yell to the sheep and they would hear his voice, know his voice, and come running. They trusted him. The sheep trusted him. They depended on him. They loved him. Verse 15, as the Father knoweth me, even so know I the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Okay. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd. So to me, what all of this is doing is it's really presenting a strong case that the pattern of the Exodus story, including the foundational stuff, it very much aligns with the life of Christ. And we're talking about, we can apply this to his second coming as well. Right now, we're just looking at this. It very much aligns with what we see about Jesus, about his coming, and about prophecy, and about the end times. We can very much line it up. In fact, when I was first doing this study, I'll just show you because I haven't erased it yet. What I did was I did it this way, where this timeline is the Exodus story and this timeline is the Jesus story. And I was able to draw direct lines from the killing of the baby boys in Pharaoh's time to the killing of the baby boys in Jesus' time, to the birth of Moses and being in a royal family, to the birth of Jesus being in a royal family. Moses is grown here. Jesus is grown here. Moses kills an Egyptian here because he was striking one of his brethren, and he saw their burdens here. Jesus says, come unto me and I will give you rest for your souls from your burdens. Moses asks, why do you fight your brother? Jesus answers, love one another. Moses sits by a well. Jesus sits by a well. Moses is about to receive his new wife and new life. Jesus, in this conversation with the Samaritan woman, lays out the new wife, new life scenario. Anyway, it goes on with these direct lines from this timeline to this timeline. God hears their groans here. God hears their groans here. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob here. God renews the covenant at the Last Supper here. I will be your God and you will be my children. That is the renewing. That is the covenant that was renewed. The I will be your God and you will be my children covenant. Jesus renewed that in his blood. And so on. Hang on a second. Get my notes back up here. So what all of this is doing, in my estimation, is really creating a strong case that this Exodus timeline and the details thereof are very much matching up with the Jesus timeline and the end times timeline. As we keep going, you're going to see how clear that is. But even here in the foundation, we're seeing all those connections. It just gives strength to the case of what we looked at first, that all of this whole story was written down as an example, a pattern for you and for me, for warning and instruction unto upon whom the ends of the age has come. It's all leading up to the end. All right. So Moses was a shepherd. Jesus says he's the good shepherd. And then, of course, we see God choose, when he comes down in that burning bush, he chooses Moses. He chooses an intercessor. And of course, over here, God chooses, he chooses Jesus, his son, to be the intercessor. Moses was the intercessor who came down and went to Pharaoh and said, God said, let my people go. And Jesus is the one God chose to come down and do the will of God, do whatever it takes in order for his people to be redeemed. And of course, what it took was he became the ransom. He became the precious, innocent blood of the Lamb that would begin our redemption process. So God comes down in the burning bush. He chooses Moses to be the intercessor. And over here, he chooses Jesus to be our intercessor. And then we're told God is talking about, he's talking to Moses in the burning bush. And he says that his children, the nation of Israel, have these taskmasters. He sees their taskmasters. He says he sees their tribulations, and he sees that they have taskmasters kind of running the show and overpowering them and have the authority over them, even though they're God's son. You know, they're living under these taskmasters. Do we have taskmasters over here? Over you and over me today? Well, the answer to that is yes, we have, going all the way back, particularly to that Tower of Babel where the harlot was kind of officially born. And then she was slowed down. Her agenda was slowed down by God because she was scattered all over the world. She took all of the scattered members of the harlot took the harlot agenda with them. Okay, remember the harlot works for Satan. She's kind of like Satan's girlfriend. She is in agreement with Satan. She does the work, the bidding of Satan. Satan could care less about her. He's going to kill her one day. But she works for Satan. She agrees with Satan. She does the work of Satan. And what is she doing? Well, she sits upon many waters. She's infiltrated all things. She has a grasp on the systems of the world. And in so doing, over time, as she gets more and more control of the systems, education, entertainment, medicine, government, religion, the more and more control she has over those systems, the more and more grasp she has on people, including Christians. We're all tied up in the system somehow, right? When I say all, I mean virtually all of us. If you've ever gone to church, if you've ever gone to school, if you've ever gone to a hospital, if you've ever worked a 9-to-5 job, you're in the system. Okay? That's why in the end times we see that angel crying to the people, come out of her. He's warning the people, you got to come out of the system now because she's going down. She's going to be destroyed. So people are given that last kind of warning, come out of her now. So do we have taskmasters? And the answer, of course, is yes, it's the harlot. The harlot is our taskmaster. She's the one that has infiltrated the whole world and is running the show and has authority and influence because she lies for Satan. Okay, and we'll do one more and then we'll wrap it up. Did I skip something? God chooses Moses, taskmasters. Moses is the shepherd. Peter's. Wow. Okay. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I did miss one. Oh well. We'll do one more, and that is really the most important one. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to erase some of this to give myself some room because we're going to go full circle back to how we started this Bible study. Remember, we talked about kind of putting it in a nutshell. God hears the cries. He chooses an intercessor. He pours out his wrath. The firstborn have victory over death. They begin their path to redemption. They cross through the Red Sea. They come out on the other side and they sing their song of redemption. Okay. So what God tells Moses in the burning bush, he tells him, I am come down so that I can bring my people up and out of Egypt and into the land of milk and honey. So let's put that on a timeline. I have come down. Okay, we'll put that here. To bring my people. Okay, let's word it a little bit differently. To bring my firstborn son, okay, up and out of Egypt. Okay. I'm going to do that a little bit differently. Up and out of Egypt. Up and out of Egypt. And into the land of milk and honey. So this is the timeline, if you will, of what God said to Abraham. I have come down that my firstborn son can be brought up and out of Egypt and into the land of milk and honey. Okay. Now, from a pattern point of view, what we have here, the land of milk and honey is the day of God. Okay. Remember, there are two inheritances. The nation of Israel was going to go into the land of milk and honey and take possession of the land. But we also find out that God establishes a priesthood, and they're going to have no part in the land of milk and honey. They'll live there, but they're not going to inherit a plot of land for their tribe, for the Levitical tribe. Instead, God says, I will be your inheritance. God is the inheritance of the priesthood. So we have two inheritance. We have the land and we have God himself. The nation of Israel inherits the land, right? The different tribes, they inherit the land, but the priesthood inherits God himself. Okay, so down here, we have the nations. We have the nations. They inherit the new earth. Okay, they're like these guys, the people who finally march into the land of milk and honey and lay claim to their inheritance. But what about the priesthood? Okay, the priesthood, God says, I am your inheritance. The priesthood, they inherit God, or in this case, they inherit Jesus himself. And by inheriting Jesus, they inherit everything that was given to Jesus by God. They're co-heirs with Christ. So the priesthood inherits Jesus and everyone else inherits the new earth. And I think these guys are going to inherit the new heaven, but that doesn't matter right here and now. But that's just what I think. So anyway, getting back to this, God says, I come down so that my firstborn son will go up and out of Egypt and into the land of milk and honey. But once again, they had a little layover here. They had a layover. It was the 40 years in the desert. Okay. And so for us, the day of God begins here, but we have our layover, right? We have our layover. It's the 1,000-year reign of Jesus. Okay. This is our layover. Okay. And then we go into this. We have this little season here where Satan is released and he deceives the nations, and then the great white throne comes down and everyone is judged, and then the heaven and earth is made new, and people step into and make up the nations and inherit the new earth. Okay? But if we follow the pattern, what we have here is Jesus come down, and of course there's two parts to that. There's part one, his first coming. There's part two, his second coming. Jesus comes down. And he brings the firstborn son up, which is what he's doing right now. He's bringing us up. We're on our path to redemption if we are born again. And he's going to bring us out, up and out. Not of Egypt, but of the world. Okay? When he does that, we will go into heaven. Okay? But then when the reign of the beast is over, we're going to come back down to the earth to our predestination location. and reign with Christ for 1,000 years before the day of God begins, the land of milk and honey. Okay, and so what we see in the story of Exodus is God comes down in the burning bush and he's telling all these things to Moses. I have come down that I take my firstborn son up and out of Egypt and into the land of milk and honey. And of course, he doesn't mention this little layover because that happens later as a punishment because the nation of Israel, once again, is unfaithful. So with all that said, what we have here is I'm making up a very strong case for this idea that the Exodus story is a pattern. The redemptive pattern of the nation of Israel, God's firstborn son, is the pattern for you and for me, and it tells us a lot about our plan, our story of redemption, our path to redemption. And next week, when we continue this Bible study, we're going to keep going, and we're going to see how the details continue to line up. And this is just we'll start off next week right here, and then there's an entire another page of these connectors from the Old Testament Exodus story of redemption to our story of redemption. So with that said, I'm going to take off. God bless each and every one of you. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.